Good morning. General, do you confirm that you are still under oath? Thank you. Dr. Madima.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you. We are now ready with the re-examination. We have just a few questions to ask the General. General Bain, sometime in the past 2 days, during your testimony, you made mention of paper aircraft.
I'm sorry, Dr. Madima, we're struggling to hear you. You're talking too softly.
I beg your pardon, Chairperson. I was saying that, this way, is it better this way? Yeah, thank you. General Bain, I was saying that in the past 2 days, you made mention of paper aircrafts. Would you be kind enough to explain to the Commission what that means or what that entails?
Chair, one of the aircraft that was on the short list for the Alpha, the Advanced Light Fighter aircraft, was the Daimler-Benz AT2000. And during our evaluations, we visited the contenders, and this aircraft is what is termed was still a paper aircraft. In other terms, it means no metal has been cut, is the terminology if you speak call it the lingo. In simple terms, it means that this aircraft is still in its concept phase. So it is a design on paper, and also has, when we visited the company, they could show us a large model, probably something like 4 or 5 times the size of the model up on the stand, of what their concept was that this aircraft would look like once it was developed and designed. In other words, very early in the development phase. And that is what then is termed a paper aircraft. As it turned out, on the request for information phase, this aircraft was looked at because there are certain advantages of starting a development, as would have happened on the future medium fighter, of an aircraft such as an AT2000. It would mean involvement through the design and development and others. The other issue, obviously, it would be a very high risk because you're starting from paper. Whereas other aircrafts could be flown, etc. So I think if that puts that into adequate context, that was what was meant by a paper aircraft. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, General. You might have touched on this issue on Monday or yesterday, but again, would like you to put meat to the bone, more emphasis on what informed the choice between the between the 2 and the 3 tire system for the Air Force?
I think, Chair, both the Deputy Chief of the Air Force and myself have at length described that the Air Force, right from the beginning, always had a 3-tier training system, not only for its fighters, in fact for all aircraft. For all our aircraft, there is a wings course, there is a type of stepping stone aircraft, and then your frontline fully operational aircraft. And in the case of the fighter line, always the same. In the past, Harvard, Impala, Mirage, and then on to other types. However, I also alluded to the vast budget cuts which occurred during 1990 and 1997. And during this process, where the renewal of the fighter fleet was being debated and considered, prior to knowing that these would be in the SDPs, where additional government funding would be available, I also alluded to the fact that the Air Force was forced to make a very much a cost-driven and not a needs-driven decision. And so it ended up with the funding available on the capital plan at the time. The departmental planners also were aware of this with the Air Force, that it would not be possible with the funding available at that point to afford the full capability. And so, due to the fact that very early indications were that some of these new aircraft, and I have alluded to the types of technology, could possibly be transited to in what was termed at that stage then a two-tier. In other words, from our new trainer being the Astra, which had replaced the Harvard, which was obviously more capable than the Harvard. And so this aircraft was going to then be looked at as an option within the cost-driven model to see whether the Air Force could go this route, and clearly this would mean that then we would not need two systems but only one. At the same time that this occurred, the RFIs, the request for information, remember, had been received back from the advanced fighter training requirement. And I again reiterate, many people get confused between the advanced fighter trainer phase, which was put on hold because of also waiting for the packages. During that period, the Air Force looked at a number of options, up to 8 or 9 options, of how we could get our new fighter master plan fitted in with the available funding on the table. The other question that, of course, had to be looked at was the fact that the Astra, as it was at the time, did not have any capability other than basic flying, as you can allude to from the photographs which I showed. One of the options that were considered in the study was to then look at putting hard points on the Astra, arming the aircraft such that it could at least carry out the armament training. In other words, the trainee would be able to fire a cannon or at least a gun, albeit a lighter gun than what a cannon is, and drop practice bombs, and also have an aircraft that had underwing drop tanks, because you need to train the initial fighter pilot, as I alluded to, in an environment of heavyweight aircraft, different types of configurations as well. This was thought that it would be possible at the time. However, having just acquired the Astra, one of the stipulations in the Astra contract was that an agreement was reached that the Astra would not be armed. And this also led, again, the Air Force to realize that to take a aircrew member or a pilot from that Astra to even an advanced light fighter, which we had lowered our sights on, was highly risky and would be a safety risk unless managed very carefully. Also, of course, it would mean that you would have to fly a lot of hours on your fighter aircraft as such. And so the Air Force, having considered this, took the decision that it was necessary to stick with its proven record of 3-tier. This was carried in by the Chief of the Air Force to the Armaments Acquisition Council at the time, and I cannot testify to that debate. What I can say is that it was carried in by the Chief of the Air Force. This status of us having considered the option, the pros and cons and challenges that we had, and this debate took place at that Armaments Acquisition Council, and that is chaired by the Minister of Defence, as you've heard. It's the highest council. And when that reply came back to the Air Force, that the decision was that we were going to remain with the 3-tier system, that is when I was called in to say that I would be the project officer of Project Winchester, which was the registered project then for the leading fighter trainer. I hope that has answered your question. Thank you, Chair.
General, do you confirm that the decision for the three-tier system was the decision of the Air Force and nobody else?
No, the Air Force would not have made that decision. It would have been made by the Armaments Acquisition Council in terms of the decision. The carrying in of the need to stay with the three-tier system was carried in by the Air Force, and at that point it would have been the Chief of the Air Force who attends meetings at that level. And the debate, I can only imagine, was taken there with all of the senior members, and then the decision that came back, I can confirm the decision that came back because I was then called in and told. The decision is the Air Force is staying with the three-tier system, and I then became the project officer of Project Winchester at that point of time. And I think I have alluded largely to the fact that you will only move off that three-tier system if you are sure, in my opinion, and that would have been my considered opinion at the time and now, and that is that you would only do that if you could transit in the two-tier safely and adequately from a military training point of view. Thank you, Chair.
General, would you go to page 100, Commissioners? Page 100 of the bundle. You don't have it? Is it okay? You want me to read it for you? Commissioners, are you there? Chairperson?
Dr. Madima, maybe before we move from this point, just for my own understanding, can I just try and find out from the general? If I'm not, do I understand it to be saying that in terms of the contract that we had with the manufacturers of the Astra, Astra was not supposed to carry any weapons?
That is correct, sir.
Two, am I correct to say from what you have said up to now, it appears as if the South African Air Force recommended the three-tier training system and the decision was ultimately made somewhere else, and we are not part of that group of people who made that decision?
No, sir, that was made at the highest level, at the Armaments Acquisition Council, where a member from the Air Force would have been our Chief of Air Force at the time that would have attended that meeting. I was only part of the options as part of the study, the work group and work study group, of which was large, that debated and looked at the two options of two-tier or three-tier, either retaining our three-tier we had all the time or looking again to move to, possibly to move to a two-tier if we could. Thank you, Chair.
So the three-tier training system was one of the options that the South African Air Force recommended? Or is it one of the training systems that the South African Air Force said that it is one of the options that they can look at?
So the Air Force had always had a three-tier, so we'd always trained that way. Then, due to cost, the option of changing to a two-tier system was investigated and compared to the advantages, disadvantages, risks involved, and then took cognizance of the RFI feedback from the project team that had been out on the AFT program at that point in time, and some of the feedback on the other information, and then the Chief of the Air Force carried that debate into the Armaments Acquisition Council, where it was tabled by the Chief of the Air Force for discussion and decision, and the decision made at that forum was three-tier, is to continue, that the Air Force would remain with a three-tier system. Thank you, Chair.
Lastly, will I be correct to say that if it was not the cost constraints, the Air Force would have recommended that they stay with a three-tier system, because that is a system that, three-tier training system, because that was a system that the South African Air Force was used to, and they did not complain about that system. You were only forced to look at the possibility of a two-tier training system because of cost considerations.
That is how I understand it, sir. Yes. Always had that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, General. You have just confirmed that the Air Force has always used a three-tier system.
I confirm.
Now, can I take you to page 100 of the bundle? The last sentence there. Chairperson, are you there? The last sentence, General, do you see that? I'm going to read it for you, and I'd like you to comment. Documentation of the strategic planning workshop attached to the minutes of the meeting indicates that the two-tier system was not acceptable to the minister. And General, I want you to remember what you just confirmed here, that the Air Force has always used the three-tier system. Now, the first question would be, would this be the reason the minister was not in favor of the two-tier system? Knowing the history of the system that obtained the SAAF.
As I said, because I was not part of in the AAC, it was way above, my level at that point. So I can only believe then that this would not have been a decision taken lightly. It would have been debated by a higher level than just the Air Force as well, and discussed and how can I say, considered before the final decision was taken then at the AAC. But I cannot comment. I was not present at any of those sessions or meetings, so I cannot confirm that part of it. I can confirm that the Air Force always has had a three-tier system. Cost constraints led us to have to look at not only that two system, I mentioned the other options we looked at upgrading, training elsewhere. This was all part of the debate within the Air Force. I imagine there were also other debates that happened about these matters in other forums of the DoD and the system at the time. But the decision-making board or council, as I understood it at the time, would have been correctly the AAC, which was the highest forum authority at the time of these matters. But I cannot confirm, the statement as such, because I was not there or present at the time. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, let's proceed with the paragraph. The SAF Command Council then concluded that a three-tier system incorporating both the Alpha and a lead-in fighter trainer lift was essential to satisfy the requirements of the SAF in relation to fighter training and fighter consolidation in a cost-effective manner. Comment on that?
Again, I'm not a member. I was not a member of the South African Air Force Command Council. That is the Air Force's highest command council. What normally happens is, prior to going, obviously, to the higher councils where the minister and the chief of defense force would be present, the Air Force will first, obviously, have their board meeting. This was the highest forum in the Air Force at the time. where they would have heard and debated, again, those same considerations around 2 or 3 tier, and come to a conclusion, and then what happens in all our programs, it goes to the next higher forum. In this case, it would have gone to the higher forums I referred to, and then it would have ended for a final decision at the Armaments Acquisition Council. Chair, thank you.
Thank you, General. The critics, and I'm going to quote here from a book by Paul Holden, The Devil in the Detail. On page 170 thereof, 170, Paul Holden and Henny van Vieren, The Devil in the Detail, how the arms deal changed everything. The last paragraph there, it says that in 1987, General, in 1987, a decision was made to switch from a 3-tier system to a 2-tier system, largely as a means to reduce the operational costs of the Air Force. Could you comment on that? Can you comment?
Confirm 1997, not 1987.
1997.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think that's, I have said, it was cost-driven and not needs-driven. That's how we had it at our level in the debates at the levels that I was involved in, is that we need to look at not only this tier, many other options as well, because of cost constraints of available funding on the then DOD capital budget. Thank you, Chair.
General, now, was this a decision that was taken, or was it one of the considerations that were being deliberated?
I keep saying there were options that were being deliberated, the option to go to the 2-tier from a traditional 3-tier system. So the thought was it could possibly be done. So information was gathered, deliberations done, workshops held, goes to the Air Force Board, goes up for a decision. That's how I understood the process to happen at the time.
Yeah, I do take into cognizance the fact that the writers of this book are not members of the Air Force, and they were not in those deliberations and discussions that were taking place at that time. Now, General, again, quoting from the same book, page 171, at the top there it says, in November 1997, this SAAF Command Council, busy overseeing the selection of preferred bidders, met to discuss the tiered system once again. During the November 1997 meeting, apparently on the strict instructions of Modise, apparently the former Minister of Defense, this system was again changed, and it was decided to revert to a 3-tier system. This decision has been made, it was claimed, after the Air Force had sent out RFIs for a 2-tier system, that is, for just a combat fighter or Alpha. And when the responses were received, it apparently became clear to the Air Force, and especially Minister Modise, that an additional tier was needed. The important difference, however, was that the middle tier would no longer be made up of a plane that could both fight and train. Instead, it would be a plane that could only train pilots to graduate to the final tier. This, of course, meant that the Hawk which was only used for training, could not fight in combat situations, could now be reconsidered. Any comment, General?
Chair, as I said, I would prefer not to comment on the view of that quote as such, in terms, as you said. I can only go with process and with what happened in terms of the debate, and then it was at higher forums. So I certainly cannot comment on the feedback and decisions taken at boards where I was not present at the time. I can, however, confirm again that the RFIs that were sent out at that point in time was for the Advanced Light Fighter aircraft, which, remember, at that point in time had been changed then from the aft. So I'm not sure, but I see again, which I alluded to, that many people confuse the advanced fighter trainer, which would have been the light fighter, and the trainer for the future medium fighter. The future medium fighter had then been terminated or cancelled because, again, of cost, and the Air Force's frontline fighter would now be an advanced light fighter. This aircraft, again, I say, due to modern technology in aircraft, and Air Force will always look at the most cost-effective way of doing the task. And so it would have looked at, and it did look at, the possibility of then having a two-tier system, because it would have meant you would not need to have another aircraft system. We had already, however, committed to the Astra. Had at that point in time, for example, possibly the Astra not yet been replaced by the Harvard, then a different aircraft might have been chosen, but that is pure speculation. We don't know. We had the Astra. It was a given. The aircraft were delivered. There were restrictions on changing the Astra to meet and close the gap, which at the time when the RFIs went out was a possibility. And therefore, the consideration, I say again, for two-tier. When all the information was received back, and although certain contractors or contenders made statements to say that this can be done, that is so. My personal opinion on that is obviously, because the task of contenders is aircraft. But as I have alluded to, the debates where I was involved at a lower level, discussing the safety issues, the risks and the pros and cons of doing this versus remaining with our very proven three-tier system, whereby the middle-tier aircraft could also act with some or other certain collateral capability, although not designed for, were the inputs that I gave, and certainly there were not only one or two of us, there were many of the pilots and the levels that were advising this process, which I saw as the Air Force process to prepare for the decision. So I cannot comment on what is someone else's view on that. Everyone is entitled to their view, and they are respected for that view, as are contractors respected when they reply to RFOs and RFIs. Perhaps an interesting question, but we didn't have to ask it, would have been definitely something that we would have asked in the contracting phase, was that so-called companies that said that you could take a fighter pilot from an Astra to a Gripen, would they have put that as a contractual guarantee in the contract, as a clause in a contract? Because this was an RFI stage. At the RFO stage, when the same question was asked, Dassault, with the Mirage 2000, said certainly not, for example. And I don't want to get into that debate, because what I'm saying is I believe in the domain of deciding on tiers and requirements for those sort of aircraft. We did it. I think our Air Force always does it. And so the decision that came out at the end was the the three-tier system was retained. So, Chair, I don't know if that is of assistance. That is all that I can add to where I was either present or understood the situation, and then I was appointed when the three-tier was decided. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, General. Just to latch on to your explanation now regarding the RFI, can you, for the sake of clarity, can you explain what the difference between RFI and RFO, what that entails?
Yeah, I would prefer, if I can, to leave that to Captain Jordan. He is going to give an exhaustive testimony. I assure you, he is the expert in this domain. You will also hear this from Arms Corps colleagues. These are actions taken by Arms Corps. I purely alluded to them because they came up, and have, as you said, in some of the documentation and literature out there, these are mentioned. So if I could ask that we leave that explanation, which will be detailed and with evidence and with documentation, if we could leave that then to my colleagues who are still to follow from the department to testify, I would feel more comfortable with that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. General, is it correct that the Hawk only trains? And this, remember, General, what I said, this comes from the critics. Paul Holden, in one of those statements that I read to you. Is it correct that the Hawk only trains?
The Hawk is designed to be a trainer, a fighter trainer aircraft, an advanced fighter trainer aircraft, as was the Impala. However, all military aircraft have what is termed a collateral operational role. Even the Astra today has a small collateral role. We used it during the World Cup for some visual reconnaissance. The fact that an aeroplane flies and you can put military aircrew in an aeroplane means it can carry out some tasks. It could do visual reconnaissance. It could assist in what we term buffeting for point defense, where it's just flying around, getting in the way. So you can imagine, again, depending on whichever aircraft you fly, it will always have, because it's an aircraft, some collateral value. You find that airliners can be freight aircraft. You just take the seats out. You know, this is very much so. So I would not like to enter again into a debate. All I can say is that virtually all military aircraft have some form of collateral capability. But, for example, a Gripen now will be designed as a frontline fighter. Its systems, for example, will have what is called gradual degradation. If you have a failure on a Gripen, you can carry on the mission up to a point, because it will have redundancy. It will have a second system. Now, the Hawk will not have that, because it wasn't designed for that. It was designed to train. If something happens in a training sortie, you come home immediately, because you don't want to risk the aircraft. But if you have a fully operational aircraft and it's flying in a war situation where your troops need support, or it's a key program, that is why we are in the military, then you will push it to the absolute limit, your aircraft. And fighter aircraft are designed, or operational aircraft, the same with helicopters and others that are combat aircraft, have this type of redundancy. So just to hope, if I can simply put it to bed, an aircraft, if it's designed as a trainer aircraft, does not mean that you cannot use it in any other military role. It will have a degree of collateral capability. Depending on the type of aircraft, will then determine in your environment and your Air Force whether it has a collateral capability or not. There are some Air Forces, of course the bigger Air Forces, that probably would not use the aircraft for that purpose, because their training needs are a lot higher. or whatever reason. It's a doctrine and that issue. But as I said, we even use the Astra aircraft in some very small collateral capability. Chair, I hope that assists the Commission as an explanation on that statement. Thank you.
Thank you, General. Don't let the critics raise your blood pressure. Just remember that they are not as technically inclined as you are on matters pertaining to the Air Force. So whatever they write here is their opinion, as you said, and it has to be respected. However, we need to rebut some of the stuff that they write about. Now, General, can you confirm which aircraft came first in the RFO evaluation of the Alpha?
So I can confirm that the Gripen came first on the military value RFO for the advanced light fighter aircraft, on the military value, and then was also selected eventually, as we know, as the preferred aircraft. Thank you, Chair.
And how tough was the competition between the Gripen and those others that competed?
Chair, I think you will hear a lot more about this again from the Arms Corps when they testify. I can, however, allude to the fact, and I have on the previous question, that the 82,000 aircraft was a paper aircraft. It would have been a high risk, and also that aircraft additionally, when the RFIs were done, the business case was not yet secured for that aircraft. The German government had not yet committed to the development of the aircraft, and they were hoping, if I recall correctly, that the Asian ring countries would have been the main partners in this development of this aircraft, and then had South Africa elected to go in on this program, then this would have materialized. By the time we'd completed the RFOs, if my memory serves me correctly, and it will, I say again, because it's in the cost and finance part of the aircraft and the valuations, it's in the Arms Corps domain, but at that point in time, they could not supply guarantees that there was a business case yet for the aircraft. And hence you find then that between the RFI on the Alpha, where the 82,000 did well, to the RFO, this obviously meant that the aircraft on the RFO came third in the evaluations on that. The Mirage 2000 came second, and the gaps in between were not significant in terms of performance. For both the Mirage 2000 and the Gripen were both already flying. They were both already delivered to the French and the Swedish Air Force. So in terms of advanced light fighter type of aircraft, they were both, as I said, already developed products flying in two very good and established air forces, and therefore they were very, very competitive products from a military flying perspective, if that answers the question, Chair.
General, a question was posed in Parliament, or rather a statement was made that there were, currently we have 16 trained pilots for the Gripen versus the 26 aircraft that we have. Now, I'm sure a lot has been said about that. The question I would like you to clarify for the Commission is the international benchmark, pilot versus aircraft. Can you please clarify that for the Commission?
Certainly. Chair, a standard squadron benchmark is normally 16 aircraft. And then if you had 2 squadrons, you would have 32 aircraft, etc. In this case, again, due to budgetary considerations, it was decided that we would scale down to a single squadron, being 2 squadron at Air Force Base Makado in our case, and all the aircraft would go to that squadron. Ideally, you would want to have 2 squadrons, ideally. due to factors that of competition and being able to develop tactics, etc. together. But the standard is 16 aircraft. So for 16 aircraft as well, you would generally then want 16 pilots. However, if you only have one squadron of aircraft, as we did, the 26, the rationale of the Air Force in around 1999, there was a document written where we stated that we would, although we were getting one aircraft, and remember at that point we did not fully comprehend how multi-role and spin-role this aircraft was going to be. We understood it a little bit from the cheetah, but not to that degree. So the rationale was 6 aircraft dedicated for air-to-air defense, 6 aircraft would be dedicated for air-to-surface, and 2 aircraft for reconnaissance, giving you 18 aircraft, which must be available at a peak for operations, and at 65% average serviceability, which was the experience then, that led to the number of 28, which was the Air Force's minimum requirement, below the force design which was required. So, in terms of international benchmark then, at that rate of 26 aircraft and then having the sort of around 16 is what we were wanting to build up to have a capability had the steady increase in pilots continued. And hence at that stage we have trained around about that number of pilots. If that answers the question, Chair. Thank you.
General, my penultimate question is, can you comment on the flying part of the evaluation of the lift contenders?
Yes, or as I said, the overall evaluation is in others' domain, but clearly when it comes to flying, then the Air Force is the lead agency. So yes, we did fly the 3 contenders, myself and the chief test pilot of the Air Force. He would have concentrated on the airworthiness, safety, and those sort of aspects. I concentrated on the training aspects, having been from being my background, largely in the training domain and then the operational flying part. And as I said, he would have concentrated on certain other areas. And I would say, in summary, when we flew the aircraft, all 3 aircraft, may I say, would have met the requirement for the training capability of the Air Force. And the Air Macchi 339FD was of a lower performance class aircraft. The L159 and the Hawk aircraft were in a higher flying performance class of aircraft, and one could tell that they were fairly closely matched in that domain. And so the summary that I would say was that on that evaluation, the Hawk was evaluated as the aircraft that had the most capability, then the L159, and then the 339, and then the L159. But there was a rider to the L159, in fairness, from the flying perspective, and Era Vadoki were very upfront about it, is that the aircraft we flew had a what was termed the development model of the avionics in the aircraft. It was still, the airframe was proven. I've mentioned before about the engine that we flew. This was fine. But the avionics were in an early stage of development. So we, in our summary back, we said that once that avionics system is developed, and that was further evaluated through the paper exercise by the full team, which was done, I'm sure you'll hear more about that as well again when others testify about that process. But from the flying perspective, we estimated that should the avionics then become mature, that aircraft would be very close to the performance then of the Hawk in terms of flying the aircraft. So I think when the paper evaluations came on the training functionality, which was more in the defense or Air Force domain of the program, we were not surprised with the comparison of the flying part of the evaluation versus what we had flown in the aircraft. And that was the same information and summary that we would have tabled in our reports and for recommendations back to the various forums. Thank you, Chair.
Were the purchases in the Air Force perspective value for money?
Perhaps I'm not that familiar with the term value for money. So I would be a bit cautious to answer that question. It's not a term we use in our domain, a value for money term. So, Chair, unfortunately, I'm not that comfortable to comment on that. I'm unsure of the term. We use the word cost effective. That means not necessarily, least or more, but relative to the cost that you expend or utilize, you must get the most involved, because we are actually in the department or in the government, we are in a game of cost within budget, and you cost as much as possible. So we are very focused then on cost. In my view, the cost effectiveness over 40 or 50 years, when considered, is then estimated in the beginning. It's continually updated along the way, and then the measurement of cost effectiveness. The difficulty with this is always, one finds that unless you've actually operated the aircraft in your environment, what I can say is that today we know what the systems cost us, particularly the Hawk at the moment versus the Gripen, and what I can say is we are operating these two aircraft today within the cost estimates for the two systems in terms of flying cost per hour and in terms of operating them, as was predicted at the time of the decisions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, General. That explanation also does cover part of my question. But do you have one last word for the Commission that would put paid to all the critics pertaining to what the critics say regarding the purchases? Is the one thing that you would like the Commission to know, which will put paid to those assertions by the critics? One last word. Well, one last paragraph, right?
Are you referring now on the Alpha or the Lift, or the Gripen or the Hawk side? Chair, sorry, if I may ask, through the Chair, if I may ask the Doctor, thank you.
No, I was referring to the whole three-tier system that was acquired by the Air Force. What is it that you would like the Commission to know in rebuttal of the assertions by the critics regarding the purchase?
Chair, all I want to say is that the task of the project team, as directed and guided by the Air Force Command Council and the project board, was to ensure that whatever aircraft was put through the process of the request for offer and tabled in the case of the strategic defense packages to the Strategic Office Committee, which is where our role ended, was to ensure that all of those aircraft would meet the requirements of the Air Force. Then there were matters that I've alluded to, such as, in our case, our military value, we evaluated. The risk was evaluated. And then the analysis was given. And on all those aircraft, that would have been done, tabled at the Strategic Office Committee by, in this case, the team led by the Arms Corps Program Manager, and then taken through what I understood, in my view, a strategic decision-making process to the highest level of government, where many other factors, I would imagine, I don't know, I was not part of that, but I would imagine that these were strategic defense packages, and the final decision then lay with the government. And between us tabling that in that July, where all these factors and evaluations were put through on the technical, and all I know is that we presented the technical, the other departments presented their part, and from there on with the Strategic Office Committee, we then waited for the final decision in November when we heard what that aircraft was. We were not in any way party to either the other departmental submissions nor to the strategic process, if I may say, at that point in time that took place from there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Chairperson. We have no further questions.
General, one question from me. Do you perhaps know when these Astra aircrafts were acquired by the South African Air Force?
Chair, it was, I can definitely say it was either in the delivery of the first Astra, if I am correct, sir, and I will come back, I will submit, however I need to do it via the evidence leaders. We will, as the Air Force, submit the exact dates like we did for Hawk and Gripen of the delivery. I think we should submit, if you accept that, Chair, the delivery schedule dates for the 60 aircraft. From what month and year to what? I am fairly, as far as I know, definitely mid-90s were the start of the deliveries. But we will get the actual dates of the delivery from the first aircraft till the last aircraft and submit that if that is acceptable to the Chair. Thank you.
I think that will be acceptable, but then I think it's important that we have that information. Thank you.
We will supply, Chair. Thank you.
Good.
Just by way of a follow-up on the last question, as at the time of the SDPP, how many of these were there, the Astras?
Commissioner, I am not sure when this process called the SDPPs began and ended in terms of that part of the process. But I am sure when we get the dates that certainly some of the Astras would already have been delivered to the Air Force by the time the first government proposals came in. And I think, I'm not sure, but when the first government made the proposal of a package to our government, which I read and understand to have been around 1996, I am fairly confident we'd already received our first Astras. But Commissioner, that will be in the submission that we give on the exact dates. And we will say how many, what we can include in is how many of the Astras had been delivered, say in 1996 and through to the end delivery date. Commissioner, if that answers your question.
Yeah, I'm interested at the time when this question of whether you have to go for the 3-tier system or the 2-tier system, when this was discussed at that time, you don't have an idea of how many of these Astras were there at that time?
Commissioner, that would have been in November 1997, so I'd have to come back on exactly how many Astras had been delivered by that period. But we will submit that in light of your question. We will submit it as such that it will be clear when the first aircraft came, how many aircraft were delivered. I understand that's your question to me, and we will submit that in writing. How many were delivered at the beginning of the SDPs, and then were they completed perhaps by then? I can't say sitting here now. And then when was the last one delivered? I will be able to submit, the Air Force will be able to submit that in writing as a statement, Commissioner.
You see, my question leads to this. If you had opted for a 2-tier system, for instance, what would have happened to the Astras?
Commissioner, the Astra would have been the first tier. It would have been tier 1, and from that wings on the Astra, the combat pilot would have then gone straight onto the Gripen today.
Was that going to be feasible? And
Sir, that was what that debate was about, and the decision was that it would not be feasible.
Thank you. Is the Astra the same as the Pilatus?
Pilatus Astra.
Lastly, from my side, in that information that you are going to provide to us, can you also include, if it is possible, the days on which the process to acquire those Astras started?
We can, in other words, when the staff target for that project was signed, would have been the start of the project.
Yeah, I think that will be helpful.
Yes, and that would have certainly been, it would have been considerably earlier, sir.
Thank you. If we can just get more or less that, if we can get that information.
The Air Force will make sure that that is submitted.
Thank you. Advocate Parr, I suppose the General can be excused.
Yeah, no further questions, sir.
Thank you. General, thanks a lot for the information that you have given us. You are now excused from attending these hearings. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Advocate Parker, I was told that you will require some time to sort out the papers before we can call the next witness.
It is correct, Chair. Ms. Ramakaka will proceed with the next witness. We just require just a short adjournment to prepare the bundles.
What is short adjournment? Assistant 5:11 now. 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes?
15 minutes. 15 minutes.
15. Yes. We'll give you an extra 5. Let's make it 20 minutes.
Thanks, Chair.
We'll adjourn.
was born in Johannesburg on the 9th of February 1949, and I matriculated at the Kimberley Boys High School at the end of 1967, whereafter I reported for compulsory military training at the Air Force Gymnasium in the beginning of 1968. During that phase, I went through a selection phase for pupil pilot's course, and I was successful. And on the 10th of July 1968, 10th of June 1968, I reported to Central Flying School Denotta to commence my basic flying training on the Harvard aircraft that has been alluded to by previous Air Force members.
And now, sir, will you please take us through the courses that you have completed? That is the flying courses completed and flying units where you served.
Mr. Chair, what I've done is I've broken the courses up into flying courses and ground courses, and where some of them are combined, I will very briefly just mention them. As mentioned, I did the basic flying course at Central Flying School Denotta over the period 1968-1969. Thereafter, or while there, I was streamed in the Air Force terminology means selected to serve in a transport aircraft role. I was then transferred to Air Force Base Bloemspruit, where I underwent a multi-engine conversion course on the Dakota DC-3. Having completed that, I was transferred to a squadron at Eysterplaat, 25 Squadron, where the basic role was air transport and secondary role was assisting in flying the pupil navigators that were going through their practical phase. I served at 25 Squadron from 1970 to 1973, whereafter I did an Albatross conversion course and was transferred to 27 Squadron, also at Air Force Base Eysterplaat.
Can we pause and request you to give the Commission information on your service within the 27 Squadron at the Air Force Base Eysterplaat?
Mr. Chair, as I've mentioned in my statement, that I served at 27 Squadron during a very interesting time. Admiral Hicks had alluded to the fact of the importance of the Cape Sea route, and at that stage the Suez Canal had been closed from 1969 and was only reopened in 1975 to the best of my knowledge. And our task on flying Albatrosses was to investigate the shipping moving around the Cape and the South African coast. And to give an example of the amount of shipping at certain times, a flight or a patrol between Cape Town and Port Elizabeth, over 100 ships could be investigated during such a mission. That just goes to show the importance of the Cape Sea route and the necessity for some of the equipment that was mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Colonel. Then you mentioned that having served in the squadron, you then changed lanes. That is, you actually converted from the fixed wing to the rotor wing. Shall you please take us through?
Mr. Chair, that is correct. I served at 27 until the middle of 1975, whereafter I was applied to change lines, which means I moved from a fixed wing aircraft type to a rotary wing or a helicopter type. I started my basic helicopter training at Eysterplaat, did the advanced flying phase of and thereafter was transferred
You mentioned that while you were with Seriti, you were flying the Alouette helicopter.
That is correct, Chair.
And as a pilot with the Alouette 3, what other information, especially
At that stage, I was overawed with the capability of the Alouette. But as time moved on, and my statement right for this, that we realized that the Alouette was reaching the end of its service life.
right? Then you proceed to inform the commission that time is kind of undertook the pilot mission in 19. Now, can you just inform the commission which treatment were you taking in order to
Chair, without going into too much detail, when piloting either a conventional aircraft or a rotary aircraft, our primary navigation aid is a map. However, the navigator very often has no visibility outside, and he is forced to make use of plotting charts, make use of sections, take sunshots, star shots, plot position. And this just gave me as the air crew member totally different perspective of how difficult the navigator's task actually is compared to how easy it is.
Thank you, Kenya. Then you proceed to talk about your position as a in. Will you please give us more details about this? And maybe, let me just say, it is also important to talk about that in relation to your earlier indication that you are supplying the route away. And here now, we're talking about the system.
Chair, the normal progression for instructors in South African airports is to start your instructor course on, at that stage, on the Harvard. Even though I've been fixing for some time flying rotary wings, very much like riding a bicycle. One never forgets to ride a bicycle, so it was fairly easy to get back swing of things on Harvard. I then completed my instructor course and served as a flying instructor at Central Flying School until we were hired shortly from instructors at the helicopter flying school in Bloemfontein, and I was transferred back to Bloemfontein.
Now, after you were contained, you then started flying the single engine turbine helicopter, that is the Alouette 3. Will you please then take us through curriculum 3?
Chair, as I said, I successfully completed my rotary wing instructor course in 1979. And the duration of 98, I served as the instructor for students that were converted onto rotary wing. During my stay at 17 Squadron, working at 87 Flying School, the decision has been made at Airport Headquarters to commission a new squadron at Airport Base Westergaard, equipped with multi-engine aircraft. And as mentioned
Earlier, at this stage, I was not qualified to fly a multi-engine helicopter, and had to undergo 2 courses, one onto the Super Freelon helicopter, which is a 28-seater, 3 engines, and shortly after that I converted onto the Puma, slightly smaller but still considerably bigger than the Alouette, 16 seats and 2 engines. I was then transferred to start the new squadron, which was known as 30 Squadron at Air Force Base Eysterplaat.
Yes, thank you, Colonel. Will you then take us through your position and your duties during the period from 1981 to 1986? That is the period when you were actually exposed to the Super Freelon, the Pumas, within that squadron, 30 Squadron.
Mr. Chair, as mentioned, having successfully completed my conversion course onto the 2 helicopters mentioned, I served at 30 Squadron from 1981 until 1986, and one of the primary roles at that stage was to support Special Forces operations of a naval ship known as the SAS Tafelberg that was converted into a helicopter carrier, and I was fortunate enough to be some of the members that did all the development flying to ensure that we could operate off this ship successfully. A secondary role of the squadron was in support of the motor vessel SAS Agulhas, which is the research ship from, at that stage, Department of Environmental Affairs, and their task was to resupply the Prince Edward Islands, Gough Island, and as well as in Antarctica, the Sanai base in Antarctica.
Now, Colonel, take us through to the time when you now became the multi-engine turbine helicopter instructor. What I noticed from your curriculum vitae is that you had firstly become a fixed-wing instructor. Subsequently, you served as a rotary wing pilot instructor, and now you were appointed to be a multi-engine turbine helicopter instructor. Will you take us through, please?
Mr. Chair, this is again the evolutionary phase. I had converted onto these types, but needed sufficient experience before I could become an instructor on type, and my services were required so that I could impart my knowledge to the other pilots on the squadron that needed to embark on the SAS Tafelberg.
You have just alluded to the fact that you had to undergo certain, or you had to obtain certain instructor positions before you could be appointed to an instructor on type. Can you just elaborate a bit on what you mean by the appointment to be an instructor on type?
Mr. Chair, it all revolves around experience. One does a conversion onto a particular type. You are able to fly it, but your experience and knowledge of the machine is fairly limited. And once one has sufficient experience, then you would move on to become an instructor. And with that experience, you are able to impart it to the young pilots that possibly don't have that kind of experience.
Right, thank you. Then let's proceed to deal with the lunar operations course on the Alouette that you underwent. Will you explain to the Commission as to what the lunar operations course entails?
Mr. Chair, at this stage, operations were moving or in a transitional phase from day operations to night operations. Up until this stage, night operations were extremely difficult because of the lack of night vision goggle technology available worldwide. And this was the groundbreaking phase within the South African Air Force where we acquired night vision goggles, and I attended the course flying the Alouette helicopter, doing the lunar operations course where I was exposed to the utilization of night vision goggles.
Right. Colonel, you allude to the fact that this was the last flying course of your Air Force career. In fact, the last flying course of your Air Force career was a conversion onto the Oryx medium transport helicopter. Will you expatiate on that, please? Yes.
Mr. Chair, would you like me to start again? While at 30 Squadron, I was appointed the project officer of an avionic upgrade that was being implemented onto the Super Freelon helicopter. And for my services rendered towards the end of 1986, I was approached to head up the Oryx development program that had been commenced, and I then transferred to Pretoria, where I became the project officer for the Oryx medium transport helicopter. The aircraft had not yet flown at that stage. We went through the developmental phase, and once it was flying, we had to put it through an intensive flight trial unit to validate the performance, logistics supportability, training aids, etc. on this particular product. And I deemed it necessary to do a conversion onto type so that I was able to, at first hand, identify some of the shortfalls that the project had entered into. And that was the last flying course that I did in the Air Force. That was in 1990 on the Oryx.
Colonel, you mentioned that you became a project officer for the avionic upgrade. Can you just give us more information on that? Because we have already heard a lot about the avionics of the equipment, but it would help for you to enlighten us, especially regarding here to the fact that you were the project officer of the avionics upgrade in this respect.
Mr. Chair, in order to carry out a project successfully, certain courses have to be done, and I address those under my ground courses. I can enter into some of the specifics now, or I could cover them generically when I do the ground courses.
It is acceptable that you'll deal with them when you deal with the generic ground courses. Shall we then proceed? Maybe, Colonel, it would help for you just to inform the Commission as to what are the basic requirements for one to qualify to become a project officer within the South African Air Force.
Mr. Chair, the very basic requirement is the will to get involved in the developmental cycle of what a program consists of. So it is in someone's makeup to either want to or not want to. And I was desperately keen to get into this, and looking back on my career, I'll never regret having entered into that phase of acquisition. However, the first course that one needs to do a project officer's course, and obviously whatever you're developing, you would like to fly or someone else to fly, and in order to ensure that the product that you deliver is at the right specification, I deemed it necessary to do a maintenance test pilot course, which I completed. I'll just have to look at my notes, please, Mr. Chair. Correct. In 1982, I successfully completed the maintenance test pilot course in Pretoria.
I beg your pardon, Chair. Shall you then please take us through to 1990 when you participated in the Oryx intensive flight trials?
Mr. Chair, once again, this was a unique concept that was utilized in the South African Air Force. The objective was to take the complete product, as I mentioned, aircrew capabilities, aircraft performance, publications, logistics support, in order to see how well this product met the requirements of the end user, being the South African Air Force. And what we did is we took a prerequisite number of helicopters, which were 5, and we flew them intensely to certain servicing schedules to see that the technical crews could carry out the services, that the correct ground support and test equipment were available, the correct spares were available, and the correct spares holding were available, and also to ensure that the aircrew syllabi was suitable to qualify the people to carry out the operational roles expected of them of the Air Force. This concept is no longer used, unfortunately. It is now referred to as an operational test and evaluation, which in the times that we live in is possibly a compromise, because in my opinion insufficient hours are flown on the operational test and evaluation to validate all the criteria that one is able to measure on an intensive flight trial unit.
Thank you, Colonel. Shall you then now take us through to 1992 when you concluded your flying career? That appears in page 9 of the bundle I.
Mr. Chair, as mentioned, my last course was in 1990. Thereafter, I attended the Senior Command and Staff course during 1991. And in 1992, I wanted to get back into flying, but unfortunately, due to the pressures of the project management, I was unable to give it my full support, and decided to hang up my gloves at that stage with about 6,000 flying hours.
That you had flown in excess of 6,000 hours, flying hours. Can you just give the Commission information on the flying hours as to whether there are any medals or any recognition given to members who would have flown certain hours?
Mr. Chair, pilots are identified by their pilot wings, which we wear on our left breast. At present, once a student qualifies or receives his wings, he receives a bronze wing. As he gains experience, and at 500 hours, he graduates to a silver wing. However, some of us lucky members that were able to stay in the cockpit long enough, and after accumulating 2,500 hours, we are awarded our gold wings.
Now, within the South African Air Force, are the gold wings the highest or the best way of showing that you have achieved the best in terms of acquisition of wings, flying wings?
Mr. Chair, that is correct. However, that award does not necessarily stop at 2,500 hours. We have an Aviation Safety Directorate that looks at the members' performance, and in recognition of accident-free hours, certificates are handed out at regular intervals for accident-free flying.
With your vast experience in flying, did you obtain any of the certificates, Kenna?
Mr. Chair, I must be honest, the answer is no.
Now, shall we proceed to deal with the ground courses that you completed? That appears on page 9 of the curriculum of Bundle I.
Mr. Chair, I'm almost embarrassed to mention the first course if I see the degree of legal prowess around me. So my humble attempt at not becoming a lawyer, but at least understanding something in the legal environment. In 1971, I carried out or completed a basic law course at the Air Force Gymnasium. And however, it being a very basic course, it stood me in good stead in later parts of my career during contract negotiation phases.
And shall you then proceed to deal with the course that you undertook in 1972?
I'm sorry, Ms. Lamakaka. Just from my understanding, why are the places where you're training, do they call them Air Force Gymnasium? Why a gymnasium?
Mr. Chair, I'm not quite sure what the origin of the name was or is, but that was the base where all potential members of the South African Air Force underwent their basic training. And I'm not quite sure why it was called the gymnasium, but to get through the place is possibly better said than going back again.
Colonel, will you then proceed to take us through to 1972 when you completed your junior joint warfare course at the South African Air Force?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to combine 3 ground courses, the one being the junior joint warfare course in 1972. Then in 1983, I completed the senior joint warfare course. And then I'd also like to allude to a forward airborne controllers course that I did in 1997. And just to explain the benefits that were gained from those courses during the latter work when I was writing requirements and various documents to have projects registered in the Air Force.
Yes, Colonel, you may proceed to deal with the courses jointly.
The next 3 courses have already been addressed under the flying phase, but for each flying phase there has to be a ground phase. And these 3 courses were the Pilot Navigators course in 1976, the Fixed Wing Instructors course 1977-78, and the Single Engine Turbine Helicopter Instructors course in 1978.
Yes, shall you then proceed to deal with the ground courses that stood you in good stead during your various project management responsibilities?
Mr. Chair, as mentioned earlier, I attended the Senior Command and Staff course at the Air Force College in 1991. I also carried out various project officers courses in Pretoria, culminating in the pinnacle of doing Professor Otsparius' system engineering course in Pretoria.
Thank you, Colonel. Shall we now proceed to deal with your managerial experience?
Mr. Chair, again, I will combine two activities. I mentioned earlier that I served as the Super Freelon Avionics Upgrade Project Officer until 1991, as I mentioned, from 1983 till 1991. That's when the Freelons were phased out. And I also mentioned that with that experience, I was appointed as the project officer for the Oryx program. And that was the start of my transition from being an avid aviator to a program manager or project officer.
Right. Shall you then take us through to the time when you were on the Oryx project?
Mr. Chair, this part is very important to point out that at what stage the Air Force identified a potential gap. As I mentioned, while I was on the project, the Oryx project, I commenced a study to determine the requirements of an Alouette 3 replacement. This information was incorporated into various versions of the user requirement statement. And as I mentioned, it's important to note that this requirement was identified as early as 1992. And an in-depth study was done to determine what the profile of a possible replacement helicopter would look like. Technologies had moved on. We all know that the electronic world is a fantastic race, and we all try and catch up. And we had to make sure that what we identified, or the profile for this possible replacement, needed to be scientifically identified. We gathered as many specialists as possible and went through the various roles and determined what systems would be required to satisfy these roles. And once this had been done, one doesn't just decide to replace the helicopter. We went into an in-depth study to determine the feasibility of possibly upgrading the Alouette 3. And later in my statement, I will refer to extracts from the staff target where the results of this study were highlighted.
Right, shall you then take us through to 1993 when you were transferred to the South African Air Force headquarters as the personal staff officer to Chief of Air Staff Operations? Will you please just indicate as to what that position entailed?
Mr. Chair, as mentioned, I was transferred to Air Force headquarters as the personal staff officer to a very senior general. And this was the first introduction that I'd had to the strategic thinking of senior officers in the Air Force. And I was like a sponge, absorbing all this information. It was a real transformation for me, even though I had been subjected from the cockpit to program management. At the strategic level, things happened very differently.
Now, Colonel, in 1994, you were transferred to the post of Staff Officer for Battlefield Support. Will you please elaborate on that position as to what it entailed?
Mr. Chair, as mentioned, in 1994, I was transferred to the, as the Staff Officer for Battlefield Support. There I was responsible for future rotary wing and fixed wing capabilities. During this tour, I was appointed as the User Specialist Officer for the Maritime Helicopter Capability and the Alouette 3 replacement. While I was in this post, I wrote the required operational capability for the LUH as well as the staff target. These two documents were approved in 1995, which was the required operational capability, and the staff target in May 1996. I also participated in the drafting of the URS, User Requirement Statement, for the Maritime Helicopter Capability, and drafted the first version of the Alouette 3 replacement user requirement. These two requirements were eventually satisfied with the acquisition of the Lynx 300, which was part of the Corvette, and the Augusta A109 as the light utility as we know it today.
Now, in 1996, you were transferred to the Directorate Projects, where the acquisition process for the Alouette replacement program was initiated. Will you give the Commission more information on your position in this capacity?
Mr. Chair, at this stage, all the staff work, or in layman's terms, the relevant documents had been promulgated, and I can go through them. In 1992, the Alouette 3 replacement capability study was done. The upgrade study was done in 1993. The user requirement version 1 was done in 1994. The required operational capability was 1995, as well as the staff target being approved in 1995. And as we've heard from previous speakers, that once the staff target is approved, the program receives project status. So with the approval of the staff target, the future LUH program, as it was known, was then registered as Project Flange.
Right, thank you. You may proceed then to take us through your appointments in respect of the various projects.
Ma'am, could you repeat the question, please?
Will you then take us through your curriculum vitae up to the time when you were appointed to finalize the Augusta project?
Mr. Chair, while at Director Projects, the joint project team compiled a request for information document. This is a non-binding document, and it was sent to 16 potential bidders to satisfy, or not necessarily satisfy, that might have an interest in satisfying the LUH requirement. These 16 or potential 16 suppliers were evaluated through the Arms Corps evaluation process, and 3 helicopters or suppliers were shortlisted, and I will mention them in alphabetical order and no other preference. The Augusta from the Finmeccanica company for the A109 power, and I mention in italics power because this subsequently changed to the LUH. The Bell Textron, a division of Canada Limited for the Bell 427, and Eurocopter, a subsidiary of the European Aerospace and Defence System for the EC635.
Right, Colonel, after the shortlisting of these three bidders, then the traditional acquisition process was then overtaken by the SDPPs. Shall you please take us through that process?
Mr. Chair, by tradition, I mean that all the relevant documentation had been promulgated, as I mentioned, and then one would normally go out on request for information, which was done, and then the next step would be to go out for request for offer or request for proposal. However, at that stage, the SDPP process was starting to overtake our normal or traditional acquisition process. And we were requested to issue a second request for information. And the reason for this being that the traditional acquisition process never had a requirement for industrial or defense participation. National industrial participation or defense industrial participation. And this was a new initiative brought about with the launch of the SDPPs, that this became a very big driving force in the acquisition process, which was not done previously.
Right, then in 1998, a request for offer for 60 units was issued. Will you please elaborate?
Mr. Chair, that is correct. I would like to first get to the quantities and then the process. Various other presenters have mentioned the white paper of 1996 and the correction of 1976 and the defense review of 78. In the defense review, a quantity of 60 helicopters was included, and this stemmed from the study that was carried out in 1992, where we determined, in order to satisfy an Alouette replacement, a quantity of 60 units would be required. Having this figure, we were requested and tasked to draft up a request for offer, and we were instructed to include the NIP and the DIP information, and we were only to send to the 3 finalists that I mentioned earlier.
Right, thank you. Then in November 1998, the Cabinet announced that Augusta Company had been selected as a preferred supplier for the Alouette. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, that is correct.
Then the contract negotiations followed immediately thereafter, and the contract was then signed on the 3rd day of December 1999, and the contract was to take effect on the 1st day of April 2000.
Mr. Chair, that is correct.
Now, subsequent to the conclusion of the contract, you were then relocated to the Augusta helicopter facility in Italy in May 2000, where you served as the project officer until December 2003.
That is correct, Mr. Chair.
And your tour of the project was then terminated, and you were then recalled to South Africa.
That is correct, Mr. Chair.
Then required from the South African Air Force at the end of February 2009, having served the Air Force for over 41 years. In March 2010, you were approached by the South African Air Force to serve in a reserve force capacity to assist in finalization of the LUH project, that is the project in respect of which you had undertaken a tour to Italy.
Mr. Chair, that is correct. Unfortunately, the project had not had a project officer for about 18 months prior to me being called up, and there were issues that needed to be closed. Certain components that had been identified during the operational test and evaluation had to be improved or were not procured during the initial phase, and we had to initiate this. There were certain deficiencies on the helicopter from the production line that had to be rectified, and they required someone with managerial skills, and I was recalled from my happy retirement to proceed with the task.
Thank you, Colonel. In actual fact, when one looks at the fact that you were recalled in or around 2003, and almost 7 years later, you were then recalled as a reserve to the Air Force to come and assist complete what you had studied. Now, you indicate that during the period, no one was then absorbed to finalize the project. Is that correct? Is my understanding correct?
Mr. Chair, that is not 100% correct. When I handed over the project responsibilities at the end of 2003, there was a replacement project officer appointed. He, however, resigned, and a third project officer was appointed who served on the project for, if my memory serves me correctly, for about 18 months before he was transferred. And unfortunately, they required someone, once he'd left, to take over the reins, and I was requested to do this.
Now, ordinarily, what were the projections for the finalization of this project?
Mr. Chair, to the best of my knowledge, and I'm speaking under correction, it actually falls in the Arms Corps domain who do the contract administration. So I would like to say that I'm not 100% sure, but to the best of my knowledge, the program should have been concluded around about 2010, 2011. However, as I mentioned, that during the operational test and evaluation, certain deficiencies were identified, and new requirements were identified, and some of them had to be rectified. So the original acquisition plan contents have been concluded. So that would have been phase one of the project was concluded. So I think one should not look at it as the program just dragging on. There were certain phases that were concluded, and the system has been handed over to the Air Force. However, the delta or additional requirements are in the process of being resolved at this stage.
Now, you do indicate in your curriculum vitae that you are still being utilized in the post of finalization of the LUH, and this work you do discharge for 3 days per week, and also you are charged with the responsibility of being utilized by the Directorate Helicopter System for 1 day per week. Can you just elaborate on these posts as to what it is that you are doing, what you are expected to do with your assistant as a reserve force member?
Mr. Chair, in the project environment, as I mentioned, there are certain contracts that need to be concluded. There's certain reports that have to be generated to wind up a program. At the end of the day, the end user would like to know whether the product actually meets what was specified in the user requirement. And we are in the process of generating this report, which is called a deviation report. There was a report written in 2002, but that report was generated on information obtained from the original equipment manufacturer, because at that stage the LUH had not flown. So we now have to go and validate that the original deviation report is correct, and if not, update it so that the end user, the Director Helicopter Systems, is happy to accept the product in its totality.
Now, how are you utilized by the Directorate Helicopter Systems?
Mr. Chair, as mentioned, I serve 1 day a week at the Director Helicopter Systems. The Directorate is without a doubt the busiest directorate in the Air Force. It's a very complex system to manage. To the best of my knowledge, the General has helicopters at 5 or 6 different bases. He has 5 different helicopter types, and the management of this directorate requires all the skills he can muster, and for that reason I assist there for 1 day a week.
Colonel, you have an experience in excess of 20 years in management of projects. Will you please give the Commission an overall experience of your managerial position, especially in respect of the projects?
Mr. Chairman, I must admit that I was extremely lucky during my Air Force career to have managed as many programs as I have. Some people never get the opportunity. I had multi-opportunities. As mentioned, I started off with the Super Freelon upgrade program, avionics upgrade program. I was then involved in the Oryx program, which ended up being an extremely complex program. There was industrialization, there was development, and as the requirements changed, the original Oryx was meant to be purely as a land-based helicopter. The requirements changed, and we developed 2 models that could operate at the coast. Some of them only had flotation gear, others had flotation gear and blade folding, which was quite unique at that time. And then, because, as I mentioned, we were in support of the Department of Environmental Affairs, and the Pumas that they had were, wouldn't say incapable, but were lacking in the cargo carrying capability. The project was requested to modify 2 Oryx to be able to operate off the the MV Agulhas, so that it had blade folding, flotation gear, heating for the main and tail rotor blades to be able to operate in the extreme conditions as found in Antarctica. Thereafter, I was very lucky to be involved in the maritime helicopter program, and in parallel to this on the LUH program. And when it came to the negotiation phase, I was unable to multiplex sufficiently to give sufficient inputs into both, and then I relinquished the maritime capability helicopter and stayed with the LUH. And just to give a brief overview on the responsibilities of a project officer. Primarily, we are working with state funds. So sound financial management is imperative. Secondly, we are not building this capability for ourselves. We are building it for the organization. And it is our responsibility to ensure that what the project officer delivers is what the customer actually wants. And that will go through, depending on the type of program, go through the whole engineering developmental cycle, which will go through the development, the industrialization, the production, the testing. And when I say testing, that could be development testing plus the operational testing, validating the training systems, validating the spares and logistics support package that was delivered, and also to ensure that the training aids satisfy the end user requirement. As General Bain mentioned earlier, one of his primary assets or major assets are his two simulators for the Hawk and Gripen. And the LUH didn't have the luxury to acquire a full mission simulator. This was in the original requirement. However, due to budget constraints, the LUH now has a cockpit procedural trainer. It has, however, got a very good visual database, and the visuals are so good that introduction and continuation training for night vision goggle operations can be carried out on the procedure trainer. I think that sums it up, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Colonel. Now I'd like to focus your attention to the medals that were awarded to your good self. Those appear in page 13, Appendix A. Page 13, Chair. May I proceed? Thank you. Now, firstly, I'll take you through the medals that you would acquire, which I will refer to as the formal medals that you would acquire by virtue of the years that you have spent with the Defence Force. Now, you have acquired the Unitas Medal, which is a medal to commemorate the unification of defense forces and armed forces in the Republic of South Africa.
Chair, that is correct.
This medal would be conferred upon all members that were integrated into the South African National Defence Force.
Mr. Chair, that is correct, and that was during 1994.
Now, you were also awarded the Medal of Good Service, that is the bronze, which is normally awarded to the permanent force members of the South African National Defence Force who have rendered the service for 10 years, qualifying service.
That is correct, Mr. Chair.
And then you have also been awarded the Silver Medal, which is awarded to permanent members of the force for a period of 20 years.
That is correct, Mr. Chair.
The Gold Medal, which is awarded to the permanent force members who have rendered a service for a period of no less than 30 years.
That is correct, Mr. Chair.
And the Medal for Distinguished Conduct and Loyal Service, which would be awarded to permanent force members who have rendered 40 years qualifying service.
That is correct, Mr. Chair.
Chair, it has just been brought to my attention that it is now 1300 hours.
We'll now adjourn and we'll come back at 2 o'clock. Thank you.